In September 1983, the Soviet missile launch detection system falsely reported an inbound US missile strike. The actions of Stanislav Petrov that day, who refused to report the launch as true, have often been described as having saved the world. This is the story of 1983, the year the world almost ended. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. Petrov's actions in the Soviet Missile Control Center at Sapukov 15 near Moscow arguably prevented a nuclear war. But what's often not talked about is why the Soviets were prepared to launch a missile strike of their own, based only on a warning for a single detection system. In reality, 1983 was a year full of tragic events and intelligence failures by both the Americans and the Soviets. Failures that left the world on the brink of war by September, without either side really knowing how close they were to a war for no reason at all. On the show today, to help me explore that fateful year, is David Schroeder. David, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Gareth. Pleasure to be here.
So for those unfamiliar with David's work, David is a historian specializing in the global Cold War and is a researcher and writer, as well as the host of the YouTube channel The Cold War, where he explores different events, ideas, and facets of the second half of the 20th century, ranging from nuclear weapons and armed standoffs to comic books and cartoons. Very good, and one of my favorite shows to watch when it comes to weird stuff that Soviet republics got up to in the late 90s.
That is the theme of the show, is the weird things on to be fair, it's not just the Soviets that were in the post-Soviet space that was kind of weird. Weirdness was happening all over the world throughout the time period. To me, it's a fascinating time period to sort of explore and figure out motivations and changes and everything that was happening through that time period, specifically 1983.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I really wanted yourself to come on and do this episode, and I was really glad when you agreed, is 1983 is such a broad series of events in so many different areas that all contribute to this growing crisis. And listeners, it is a growing crisis. Often you'll find in the media it's almost portrayed as if there's this one single moment and Petrov is involved, and we'll get to Petrov later in the episode. But the reality is that's not even necessarily the culmination of events in 1983. It's one of the major points, but it's almost not the culmination. There's just so much stuff that's going to add up in 1983 to this rising tension, isn't there?
Absolutely. I like to think of history as threads. There's multiple threads constantly being weaved. And 1983 is one of those particular years where some of the worst threads possible, really, that start decades earlier even, all come together in just the right way to make a year an annus terribilis almost, or the potential at multiple points through the year where disaster was being courted and almost, I don't want to say an almost daily level, because that's such a cliched and over dramatic statement, but there's this constant tension, low grade, high grade at certain moments. And lots of these threads all coming together to weave this tapestry of 1983, where, in my opinion, it's one of the most critical, crucial, and closest moments through the Cold War that the world came to actually ending. The Cuban Missile Crisis, without a doubt, is probably the single most volatile period and the single closest moment that we've ever come to a full-on nuclear exchange happening. But 1983 is similar in a lot of ways, but over this really prolonged period of time. It's a good chunk of 1983, and it begins earlier, but it really is this long period of incredible tension. And the fact that it remains relatively untalked about, not necessarily within the Cold War historical community, but certainly amongst the wider public. Everybody knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis, even in passing, but 1983 is sort of this black hole of knowledge that people might not have beyond, say, the Petrov incident, thanks to the Netflix documentary that was out a few years ago. So
before we talk about 1983, we can't talk about 1983 in isolation, Cold War has been going on for some time by this point. Just how long is an entire other podcast for you and me to do one day. But what's the situation coming into 1983? Why are people already on edge?
So 1983 is one of these nadir moments. But as you say, like it certainly extends. It's not just a one-time event, like a one moment it suddenly appears. It's definitely part of those threads that I was just speaking of coming out of the past. And you're probably looking at the late 70s to start really sort of understanding where that begins. The late Brezhnev period, by this point, Brezhnev, as leader of the Soviet Union, is zombie isn't quite the right word, but he's definitely, it's a gerontocracy, certainly at this point. He's quite aged. He's quite ill. He's got a number of comorbidities, struggling with an addiction to painkillers. The members of his Politburo are largely also in the same sort of situation. They're all quite old and very fixed in their ways and not really with a lot of energy to provide a lot of change to the Soviet Union. That's going to come in a few years later on in the 80s. So you've got this moribund sort of leadership happening in the Soviet Union. On the other side in the US, you have Jimmy Carter beginning a rearmament process. And yes, it's Jimmy Carter that begins that rearmament process as the détente sort of ends and begins to really collapse and completely go away. Part of what's happening on both sides is there's a nuclear rearmament, nuclear reinvigoration program that's happening from both sides. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan happens, which is reacted to by the United States. Again, Jimmy Carter, very, very forcefully. Almost immediately, Carter begins to supply high-tech weapons and gear and support to anybody who is willing to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And obviously, the Soviets don't receive that particularly well. And then this sort of continues through into the early 80s with the election of Ronald Reagan, certainly in the fall of 1980. And he's very much a staunch and campaigns on a staunch anti-communist platform, very much wants to stand up to, I'm going to use the words evil empire. That actually is a few years down the line, but it's sort of like this evil empire and standing up to communism and standing for, democracy and liberty and all the things that the United States wants to believe that it stands in. So this is really where it begins, where the détente that was happening through the late 60s and especially in the early 70s, where there's a lot of cooperation, that's all broken down. There's no dialogue. There's very little conversation happening across each side of the wall. It really doesn't prove good for cooperative relations when no one's talking whatsoever. So that's really the situation that you get by the early 1980s.
And one thing, listeners, you should take away from this as well is we often, and we've talked about this on the show before, it's really, really easy when you look back on history to see things as inevitable. So we look back now and it's very easy to go, oh, it was inevitable that the Soviet Union would fall. It was inevitable that the US would, in inverted commas, win the Cold War. It's absolutely not inevitable at this point. What you're looking at is an environment where the Soviet Union might be stagnating. Gorbachev will later describe this as the period of stagnation. It's maybe starting to fall behind the US, and particularly in terms of technological development or their own perception of what US technological development is at in terms of pace. But that doesn't mean that they're down and out. It doesn't mean that the Soviet Union is now knowing, if we're not careful, we're going to die and we need to be the ones who strike first. That's absolutely not the atmosphere here. But what they are coming into this gerontocracy that's running the Soviet Union at this point is, remember, these are men who largely served in World War II. They served and they fought against the Germans. Many of them, including several of the members of the Politburo and the one who is about to become head of the Soviet Union, are very, very aware of the German invasion and Hitler's invasion of Russia. They are very, very fearful of a similar almost strike by a more advanced nation, but they're not seeing themselves as in decline. So just bear that in mind as we talk through all of this is, from a Soviet perspective, they do currently see themselves still as an equal power. There is just a growing concern that if the US keeps developing, if it keeps having this very aggressive approach, that the US might be trying to push ahead in a way that they can't compete with in the long term.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, just to clarify and expand on that a little bit, because as a historian, that's what we do. The Soviet Union really has two economies that operate parallel to each other. The A, like literally, they're called the A economy and the B economy. And the B economy is what we in the West have often thought about in terms of the Soviet economy, where it's consumer goods. It's bread lines. It's waiting in line for no meat. It's washing machines and TVs that explode. It's that type of thing, and incredibly inefficient, poor distribution, etc. But their A economy, which is basically anything to do with the military, that is very much a world class economic stream. They're building high tech weapons. They're building high tech gear that's in demand globally. So it's really important to sort of keep in mind that the Soviet Union does have two economic systems basically happening. It's all a command economy, obviously. But that military component, which is a lot of what's feeding into a lot of what we're about to talk about, is actually quite competitive. Globally, it's just, we often think about it being one single overall economy, but it is two separate ones. And it's the A economy that's very much fueling a lot of what's about to happen.
So let's move into 1983 itself now, and let's kind of rattle through some of the early events in 1983 to really set the scene for how this year is going to go. And actually, again, almost we need to start slightly earlier than this. So we almost start just before 1983, which really is the death of Brezhnev in November 1982. What changes after Brezhnev's death in terms of the leadership within the Soviet Union?
So Brezhnev dies in November of 1982. Long expected. It's actually a miracle that he sort of hung on as long as he did. Within the Politburo, the jockeying has been happening for a number of years, quite a while. But what you end up is Andropov is selected as the next leader of the Soviet Union. And Andropov is a fascinating character just unto himself. And I really do wish that there was a good academic biography of him. It hasn't been written as far as I'm aware, certainly not in English. But Andropov's background is he's a KGB man. He's been head of the KGB for decades. He was one of the key drivers in terms of the invasion of Afghanistan. He was a key driver, certainly in terms of the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, when he was head of the KGB at that point. He was a KGB resident in Budapest in 1956 and watched the uprising happen in 1956 as well. And a lot of this is very much fueling his opinion and how he reacts to certain things. Very suspicious, very paranoid, really. I try not to use that word, but paranoid is absolutely the right word in terms of how he views external forces and external factors. Just because they're not out to get you doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. He absolutely believed that everyone was out to get him. But he becomes leader of the Soviet Union. One of the key things that he had implemented when he was still head of KGB and leading up to his selection was Operation Ryan, which is this really fascinating, sort of incredibly paranoid program of intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis that he puts into place, still as head of KGB, so it's still during the Brezhnev era, but it continues on after he's selected. And what Operation Ryan is intended to do is to working on the assumption that the West was going to launch a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. The mission statement was to effectively go and find the evidence that the West was planning. And when I say the West, it's basically the Americans, but the Brits are in there too, but it's the Americans. That Operation Ryan is tasked to go out and find the evidence to prove that the US is going to be launching a nuclear first strike. And it's not just a KGB project, it's KGB and GRU, and getting the two rival intelligence agencies to work together. Like any rival intelligence agency, getting them together is an absolute small miracle. The KGB residences across the world are tasked to do this in good bureaucratic fashion. That's what they do. They go out and they start collecting information about, how many lights are on inside the MI5 building after 6 p.m., how much traffic is coming in and out of Langley, there's just all these weird little measurables that they're working on, and that they assume that every time that somebody leaves a light on in a building, that they must be working late, which means that they're planning a first strike.
I think that's what I love about it. Is it's almost this. It's the absolute how not to run an overarching intelligence operation. If you turn around to intelligence operatives in any country, and say, go find me evidence of X, particularly if it's an authoritarian state that's giving that instruction, they are going to go and find evidence of X, because you do not want to be the agent that reports back and says, we cannot see any evidence of this, when the next day, the next residency over is going, we can see loads of evidence of this, because then you're the ones who sound like you're not doing your job. So we talk now about people living in information bubbles, and so the idea that people's brains get kind of fuzzied up. They're always looking for confirmatory evidence of their own beliefs and all of this. Andropov is absolutely at the center of one of those situations at this point, isn't he?
Absolutely. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And if listeners, there's going to be a theme that you pick up on developing about through this podcast, I suspect it's going to be the theme that there are massive intelligence failures all around. We have talked here about a massive Soviet intelligence failure, which is setting your intelligence agency up to look for a specific outcome. But also what's happening on the other side of the fence, particularly on the American side of the fence, is something that is equally problematic, which is actually none of this really gets picked up very quickly, that this is what the Soviets are doing. There's almost a sort of intelligence complacency setting in on the US, which is, we've got a good setup here. We understand the Soviets now. We're watching them to see if they're planning a first strike. What we're not really doing is watching to see how they're reacting to what we do. The only real efforts they're doing in that regard are almost because as we go through this year and as we move in, as David said, Reagan is elected on almost a principle of, let's call it, poking the bear. A key part of his sort of philosophy, his foreign policy philosophy, is just, prodding at Russia periodically. It's good in the press. It makes everyone feel good. Hoorah, yay, America. Hulk Hogan foreign policy, I've heard it described as, which I really, really like. It's very useful for him domestically, politically. And what's not happening is he's not getting reports back from the CIA in particular or anything, telling him that he should probably really stop doing that.
The US has this base assumption. It's stemming from the politicians, Reagan at the top, but certainly those around him. Reagan has this base assumption that everybody understands that what he's doing is theater, that it's politics. Absolutely, he's poking the bear. We can go through a couple of examples that sort of lead through this in terms of like literally poking the Russian bear. But it's very much it's being led with the idea that everyone on both sides is aware that it's theatrics, that it's politics. The US has a no first launch policy. You can say whatever you want. I mean, coming back to what you just mentioned about the experience of the Soviet Union at the beginning of I shouldn't say the beginning of the Second World War, at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, when the Germans basically overnight tore up their stated agreement with the non-aggression pact and launched Operation Barbarossa. That's very much like sort of this base framing that the Soviets are going into. So the US can come out with its policy of no first launch, that it will not be the first one to launch an offensive attack against the Soviet Union. But the Soviets aren't believing it. What they're doing, though, is they're watching the actions of the United States. From that viewpoint, it's very much the US being received as being very aggressive towards the Soviet Union.
We got some good examples of this early on. We talk about things in terms of this rhetoric that Reagan's pushing. Is we get beginning of March 1983, and we've mentioned the phrase already, the phrase evil empire. And the first use of that phrase by Reagan to describe the Soviets is early March. In a speech to the British Parliament, he uses that term. And from the American side, as we're talking about here, it's theater. It's theater. It's what you talk about. It's that kind of thing. But if you're Andropov and you're so wary, you're believing that an invasion's coming at some point. It's when, not if. And you're constantly thinking back to your service in World War II and realizing that the big problem in the beginning of that Russia's patriotic war period was that Stalin ignored all the intelligence that the Germans were about to invade. Andropov is determined not to miss those signs. Evil Empire is the first one of those. And within the same month, we get the announcement of Star Wars.
Yeah, very much. Star Wars is the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars. This is probably, just on a sort of side note before I really get into this, this is sort of probably my earliest recollection of what the Cold War was. I've loved Star Wars as the movie franchise since I was an infant, basically. And then, of course, my parents are news junkies. The television news was always on in the house. And so, of course, by the early 80s, there's all these references to Star Wars. And of course, I'm like drawn in, like, oh my God, they're talking about Star Wars on the news. And then there's no Darth Vader, there's no stormtroopers. Like, what's going on here? Completely let down as a kid. But this first real exposure into what the idea of what strategic defense initiative was. And it ends up being, to come back to topic and away from my little flights of fancy, what it ends up being is this, it's a concept. It's not real. Certainly at the time that Reagan is announcing it in 1983, it's barely real in 2026. But certainly in 1983, it's an idea. It's a thought that, well, what if we put satellites and lasers up into space and we can detect and shoot down ICBMs after they're launched, and we create a missile shield, a proper Golden Dome missile shield to be able to protect from any type of first strike or second strike. And this is sort of getting into a little bit of the weeds, and I don't want to get into the weeds of like how mutually assured deterrence functions, but it would affect any country, any team that can effectively put an SDI system in place can give themselves an enormous ability to quote unquote win a nuclear exchange. Nobody actually wins from a nuclear exchange, but that's not the point. It gives this huge, huge advantage.
Listeners, we're still only in March here. We are taking a very rapid move forward from here. But what we wanted to do is take the time. You really do have to understand almost the psychological and political states of both these powers to understand why everyone gets in such a flurry of panic very quickly over the next few months. And maybe we'll talk a bit in the extra about some of the examples about how the bear gets poked. We haven't even had a chance really to talk about Pershing 2 missile deployment. Just, very briefly, this is the deployment. The US is starting to deploy different and newer missiles to Germany, and that changes the narrative from the Soviet perspective. And also, what really kind of is worth noting, and we know this now from the past, is actually in June, there is one of the very rare sort of unofficial meetings between the Soviets and the US. And actually, it's Harriman, it's the US ambassador in the Soviet Union. And Andropov actually literally warns him and says, look, we are genuinely increasingly worried about what you're saying. And more critically, he says a certain phrase to him. He says, if you keep doing what you're doing, we're going to have to adopt a launch on warning status. And this meeting happens in June. David, what does launch on warning mean?
One of the key things that you sort of discover as you delve a bit deeper into how nuclear warfare works is it's all about response times. When you're launching ICBMs from the United States to the Soviet Union, that's about give or take, it's about a half a planet away. That's about a fifth, depending exactly where the missile site is and what the target is, you're looking at about a 15 to 20 minute response time from when a launch would happen to when that detonation would actually occur. Keeping in mind that cities aren't necessarily the initial targets of a lot of launches, it's actually the opponent's missile silos to try to take out their retaliatory ability. Again, coming back to this second strike capability theme, but it's very much about, say, if the Soviet Union detects a launch, they have, coming from the United States, they have about 15 to 20 minutes to figure out, A, is it real? Is it credible? And B, how do we respond? So in the early 1980s, and this is starting to happen by the late 1983, but the process is already well underway and the decision's been made, that Pershing 2 IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, and GLICMs, which is a ground launch cruise missile, which can be nuclear armed, when they're being rolled out by the Americans into NATO countries in Europe, the so-called Euro missiles crisis. Susie Colburn has a good book on this. Little plug there for Susie. When those get rolled out, suddenly that response time drops from 15 to 20 minutes to 5 minutes. So the idea is that if you only have 5 minutes from when you think a launch has happened to be able to force a response, that decision-making time, that's hugely, hugely drastically reduced. So what it means is this phrase that Avril Harriman uses, launch on warning, that in the event that you detect any kind of incoming, you have no time to determine whether it's accurate, whether it's a false alarm, whether it's a glitch in the system, anything. As soon as you think that you've detected something, you're press the button. You're turning those keys. You're initiating your full launch. It's launch on warning. That is a drastic escalation and a drastic increase in the amount of risk that you're taking, that any kind of a false positive is going to result in a nuclear exchange. So that's huge. That's absolutely enormously drastic in terms of giving that warning for launch on warning.
So remember that, listeners, that the Soviets have already warned that they are very close to moving to a status of launch on warning. And as Dave has described it, at that point, there is no decision time. You don't stop and wait and see if the launch is real. You don't see if it's a mistake. And there are mistakes. In the end of the 70s, the US detects a massive incoming strike from the Soviet Union. I forget the name of the advisor who just talks about it, one of the presidential advisors, but he talks about being woken up.
Brzezinski.
It's Brzezinski, isn't he? He talks about basically being woken up in the middle of the night and being told, yeah, by the way, the Soviets have just launched a massive missile attack at us. And he basically says, okay, go away, confirm it, and then call me back. And he decides not to wake his wife. He's like, why bother waking my wife? If the missiles are incoming, let us sleep, And it's this period that David's just described. There is time to check, and they go back and go, yeah, no, it's glitch in the system. Don't worry, there isn't a missile strike. I'm going to assume he didn't go back to bed after that. I don't think I'd sleep after that moment.
I'm assuming that's a go and get a cup of coffee and try to let the adrenaline sort of.
Yeah, I think you're into multiple cigarettes on that one.
Yeah, possibly Scotch.
Yeah.
3 a.m. Scotch is perfectly justified at that point. But
the Soviets are now in a situation here in June 1983 where they're warning the US, look, if you don't quit it, we are going to move to that status. And again, this gets mistaken as theatre. This is seen as theatre. It's a warning that's not heeded and everything else. Now, let's jump forward now. And we do, there is a little bit of wobbly lines we're doing here, listeners, to get you through this process. But we do need to talk about the incident that happens on September the 1st, 1983. And that is the loss of Cal 007 flight, isn't it?
Yeah. So Korean Airlines, that was flying from the US, leaving from Anchorage en route to Seoul. That I'm aware of. I don't think there's ever been a conclusive determination as to why it was off course. But the aircraft that would normally come down on what I always refer to as the outside of sort of the flight route on the outside of the Kamchatka Peninsula was about 200 miles off course and actually overflew the Kamchatka Peninsula, was over the Sea of Okhotsk, and coming down towards the Sakhalin Islands. And this is very much Soviet airspace. Like they have a ton of top secret facilities, like nuclear submarine facilities. There's a ton of Far East Asian military sites and whatnot that are happening out there. And there's this aircraft that's suddenly, unexpectedly overflying this territory. And there's a bunch of ins and outs that go with it. There's confusion with a rivet joint flight, like an actual US spy aircraft that's doing signal intelligence gathering. There's confusion about that. There's gaps in the Soviet radar system in the Far East. So this aircraft appears, it disappears, it reappears. And what ends up happening is that the aircraft is shot down. 236 people on board. I may be slightly off with that number, but it's about 236 people on board, including a sitting representative from the U.S. House of Representatives. And everybody's killed on board.
And we should be clear here that the blame for this, for shooting this down, sits firmly on the Soviets. Not only did they shoot the plane down, they misreport its final location, so that actually, even if there had been survivors, rescue attempts wouldn't have been able to find them. This is an awful situation all round, but it plays into what we're talking about our intelligence failures and the perception of theatre, because both sides ramp up their rhetoric in the aftermath. And you get a situation where the airports at New York start blocking Soviet flights from landing that are carrying people to go to the UN. And this is in direct contravention of the UN Charter. New York is, you're meant to have free access to the UN headquarters at the UN. That ramps up things even more. I think it's at that point that Andropov literally gives a speech where he accuses Reagan of being like Hitler. And this is another one of those classic moments. If you think, listen, of everything we've talked about before, from a US side of things, that's fine. We described you as the evil empire. You described us as Hitler. It's the game. It's the theater. It's whatever. What kind of gets missed in that? And if you think of everything we've talked about already, and we've talked about the idea of the Soviets being paranoid that the US are about to launch a sudden and secret attack. when Andropov is calling Reagan Hitler, he's as much saying, I think you're about to do to me what Hitler did to Stalin. And that just absolutely goes completely over the heads of the entire US intelligence setup at the time, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There's a very poor understanding. I think it remains to this day. There's a very poor understanding amongst a lot of people in the West of when the Russians refer to somebody as being a fascist. That's a very loaded term.
Around this period is when the Soviets do finally move to launch on warning. But at the end of September, they are operating on launch on warning. As we said earlier, the moment you detect a launch, you report it, and someone turns the keys, and our missiles will launch. And the US still does not know that the Soviets are operating at that status. And that brings us effectively, nicely, to the 26th of September, 1983, and Stanislav Petrov. Now, without going into massive detail, we've done a bit of a race through this. Listeners, the thing to take from this is, as we've talked about already, there is a technology gap. And one of the results of that technology gap is that the Soviet detection systems, they're effectively reliant on a one satellite detection system. And it is a very good detection system, but how it very broadly works is it looks for the heat that is associated with launches. And, it's no spoiler to say that this is a fake detection that it's about to make. But what effectively happens is the satellite launch system is there to detect heat. It is obviously set up to make sure it doesn't accidentally detect the heat of the sun as being a launch of missiles. And it's been tested. But what no one realizes is that in an exact certain configuration for one of those satellites, if the clouds are of a certain type and they're at a certain level and the sun is coming in from a certain angle, it is going to reflect off those clouds up into the satellite detectors, and it is going to look, to begin with, like a single missile launch, and then very quickly beyond that, it's going to look like multiple missile launches. And that's exactly what happens on that day in September.
In defense of the Soviet system, they had thought of this and they had recognized that this could be a potential problem. There was supposed to be a third over-the-horizon radar system that would verify and sort of discount this type of situation, but the technology hadn't been built yet, so that radar system wasn't in place when this new software this new technology, this new software was being rolled out by the Soviets by September of 1983. So coming back to the top of the episode, what ends up happening is the system gives launch warning and alert. Here's Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. He's the commander in the bunker at the time, and he is looking at the data that he has. He has launch on warning orders, and he looks at it, and it doesn't appear correct to him. It just doesn't feel. It feels off. And he disobeys his SOPs. Like he ignores the standard operating procedure, which would be, at the very least, to communicate up to his superiors, otherwise, or turn the keys and actually initiate a launch. It ends up that, so they sort of wait out for long enough that it's determined that, yep, this is reflection of the sun off the clouds. They figure it out relatively quickly, but certainly not within the time that if he had followed the standing orders, he would have launched basically his entire field of missiles, and everything else would have gone up. The balloon would have gone up, as Nano would sing about that same year.
And we should say that, and this is the thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked on this when we talk about this stuff, is he disobeys orders in a way that the pilot that shoots down Korean Air Flight doesn't. That pilot, again, accounts are confused. It's not unfair to say he could have taken a bit of time and looked at that and gone, hang on, that does not look like a CIA spy plane. Petrov does the equivalent of that in his bunker, and the outcome is very different, thankfully, for the world. And we shouldn't demean that. And actually, in the extra bit, maybe we'll talk a bit about the impact that actually has on Petrov. It costs him his job in the long term, because whilst he made the correct decision, the last thing you want in a military officer is someone who doesn't obey orders at the critical moment, and Petrov doesn't obey orders. And actually, I was incredibly lucky many, many years ago I met him briefly and I had several chats with him. And I was writing about this incident and areas of that. And he's a fascinating guy, and actually very, very sad and bitter in many ways. because actually he loved his country. He felt he'd done the right thing for his country, and he felt very badly treated by them. But there's two things we need to do as we wrap up the main podcast, I think. Is one is which is to point out this isn't the end of it. The US doesn't even know this has happened. No one in the West knows they've come this close. It's actually almost the next incident, and how much the next incident is the single trigger, I think, is overplayed. It's more that all of this bleed up that's been happening over the course of this year is finally starting to tick up to the people that matter for a certain point to convince the US that actually, no, you need to stop mucking around here. But the final incident we just need to cover is Able Archer. So do you want to give people the 2-minute version of what Able Archer is?
I'm not sure I could do a 2-minute version of anything, but yeah, that's so Able Archer was the short form for Able Archer is it was a command and control exercise dedicated to nuclear weapons handling and deployment. It was a training exercise, effectively tacked on to the end of, I think it was fall Reforger 83, which is sort of the U.S. plan in terms of how to move its troops stationed in the U.S., how to deploy them out to Europe in the event of escalating tensions, ironically enough, with the Soviet Union in the event of the outbreak of war. It's a couple of weeks exercise, and there's like 20,000 U.S. troops that get deployed from continental U.S. into Europe. There's all these training exercises. There's tons of communication, like coded and sometimes open traffic, that's happening that the Soviets are listening to. It's also coupled with lots of closed communication that's happening. So there's these gaps, and that very much resembles what a country would do if they were preparing for war. And again, if you're looking for signs that somebody's preparing for war, that's how you're interpreting that, as opposed to just practicing what you would actually do. Reforger starts wrapping up. At the very end, it's Able Archer, which is this command and control, how the West is going to, NATO is going to deploy its nuclear weapons in the event of a mass Warsaw Pact invasion. And it's over a couple of days, and it's unusual because they changed their codes at the same time. So basically the Soviets are cut off completely from listening to any of the traffic. It also involves several heads of state. It doesn't involve the US president, but it does involve several other European leaders, just in terms of practicing and simulating what that nuclear release instructions would look like. And it all builds up to this one evening at the beginning of November, where, by all accounts, and historian Fred Kaplan, who I respect greatly, has done a ton of research and work on this, the Soviets actually start loading nuclear weapons onto their bombers. And there's lots of increased air traffic that the Soviets are doing. They strip deploy attack aircraft, MiG 23s and whatnot, through East Germany and Poland. And they're preparing for war. They've loaded live nuclear weapons, much more common on the US side, incredibly rare for the Soviets to do this. And it sort of all hinges overnight that what's going to happen. There's a multitude of different theories in that are going around. The HVA, the East German Foreign Intelligence Service, has a spy at NATO headquarters, very highly placed. He gives this all clear at one point during this, saying that, hey, you know what? This is an exercise. Nowhere else in NATO is anybody preparing for war. Whether that message actually makes it to the correct people or not, that's still unclear according to the records. There's a U.S. Lieutenant General who's in charge, Lieutenant General Leonard Peretz, who's the Assistant Chief of Staff for United States Air Force Europe. He's the intelligence officer on duty that night, and he's basically looking at all of this increased Soviet traffic, and he makes the decision that nothing else looks untoward, nothing else looks askance. He knows that everything's a training exercise on his side. He doesn't alert anything any higher and doesn't increase the defensive posturing. That type of defensive posturing would possibly have set the Soviets off in terms of our response. So it's sort of, amazingly enough, it's the right people in the right place at really the wrong time, but it's having the right people in that to make a logical decision based on the evidence that's being presented to them, as opposed to the orders that they've been given of what to look for. And sort of the way that it's been written up, certainly very poetically by Taylor Downing, is very much like, the sun rises and a new day dawns, and the world continues, oblivious to how close the world actually came. And it really does take months, probably, for the West to start realizing just how close they came as a result of the one person that I haven't mentioned as of yet, who is Oleg Gordievsky. Would you like to talk about Mr. Gordievsky right now, or should we wait?
I feel like we owe the main podcast listeners a little bit on Gordievsky. Extra listeners, you are going to love Gordievsky if you don't know about him already. It's a fascinating story, but I will attempt to sum up the short version for people, which is that Gordievsky is a KGB officer. He is a KGB officer who became disillusioned with a lot of the activities of the KGB in the 1960s. And actually, whilst he was stationed in Denmark, he's actually turned by a combination of the Danish Secret Service, who don't get enough credit for their role in turning him, frankly, and working in conjunction with MI6, which is the British Counterintelligence Service. And the short version is Gordievsky ends up, from the 70s onwards, a British asset. He is reporting to the British what's going on. And actually, by the time we hit 1983, he's actually serving as a KGB officer in London. So he's actually one of the people who early on warns that the Soviets are already moving into this situation of looking for launch. MI6 have become aware of this, and it's filtered up through the ranks of MI6 far earlier than it does within the CIA. And actually, even by this point, by the point of Abel Archer, MI6 are almost screaming at their CIA colleagues and saying, no, you guys, you've got to stop doing this. The Soviets are serious. We have a very senior intelligence asset who is telling us that the Soviets are reading this exactly the wrong way. And we'll get into it massively in the extra bit, I think. But as David said, there are multiple triggers for what finally diffuses this in November. But one of them is Gordievsky, and it is that effectively MI6 have to give the CIA as much information as they can on what Gordievsky's doing. And they refuse to name him as an asset because the MI6 are genuinely worried that the CIA might well be compromised already. And if they tell the CIA that it's Gordievsky that's their spy, that information will get back to Moscow. So they give as much as information as they think they can give without naming him to prove his credentials. And luckily, the CIA do listen and they do accept that he's a senior asset. And then they contributes to this move of finally, as you say, calming the situation down. The irony, and we'll explore this in the extra bit, is MI6 is absolutely correct. It turns out the CIA have been compromised. To be fair, MI6 have been compromised plenty of times as well. Let's be fair here. But this is one of the times where it's the Americans' fault. And the CIA are genuinely fascinated to know who the British asset is that's that senior, because they want them for themselves. Inter-service rivalry. Why can't they have an agent at that level? So they actually ultimately start their own investigation using the information MI6 are given them to try and work out who Gordievsky is. I think his Nocton, is his code name when he's for the MI6. CIA call him Tickle, which is interesting. But they end up blowing his cover. They do indeed work out it's Gordievsky. And shortly afterwards, and about a couple of years after the events we're talking about here, Aldrich Ames, who's a CIA employee who's a Soviet spy, feeds that information back to the Soviets, who are already starting to get suspicious of Gordievsky. It has to be said. He's actually already been recalled to Moscow by this point. But it's the final nail should have been the literal final nail in Gordievsky's, coffin. That it isn't is down to a wonderful British operation called Operation Pimlico, which, if you in full kind of Hunt for Red October, Jack Ryan style, absolutely extracts Gordievsky from Moscow, from right under the KGB noses, and gets him home and gets him back to the UK. And I think he didn't die that long ago, actually. It was 2013, I think. It might be a bit later even.
I think it was a bit later. I had a professor that I took a course with a couple of years ago that actually worked with Gordievsky and had some fascinating tales to tell.
Yeah, and as with any double agent asset, absolutely never believe half the stuff that Gordievsky says. To be turned as a spy, you have to almost have a certain amount of self-interest and self-importance. And that's the thing, is if a spy is never trusted once, a double agent is never trusted twice. But Listeners, hang around for the extra bit if you want to know more about Gordievsky, because it is almost like the coda to everything we've talked about here. It's the aftermath, it's the consequences. But just to really wrap this up, we've said the theme throughout this is intelligence. It's the intelligence failures and coming together. David, do you feel that like both sides learn from this?
Certainly, and I think Washington certainly learns. So following the Gordievsky reports, finally making it to some senior figures in Washington, Bud McFarlane, who's the specific person that I should give the shout out. He was new in with the administration, had the ear of Ronald Reagan, and managed to get some of the Gordievsky report, like actual reports and documents, onto Reagan's desk. And Reagan's review of those, he took them very seriously and really sort of began to acknowledge and understand that, yeah, like he wasn't just poking the bear as a theater, like that was being received as actually being these aggressive moves. And it's sort of from about that point going forward that Reagan begins, I'm not going to say his own de-escalation, but certainly begins to understand that he can't continue to poke and poke without some sort of a retaliation possibly happening. And I think it eventually lays the groundwork. Dropov dies not long after this. Chernenko doesn't last particularly long either. And then you get Mikhail Gorbachev, who comes in, and famously Reagan and Gorbachev eventually build this really strong working relationship. And within a few years from then, the Cold War is effectively over. It's amazing how we went from 1983 as being the terrible year that the world almost ended multiple times to it being over, and it's Scorpions singing "Winds of Change" on the radio everywhere.
David, where can people find you?
I am can be found always through YouTube at I think it's at Cold War TV. You can do a search for the Cold War channel. That should come up there. And happy to people come and give 7.5, almost 8, coming up on 8 years worth of videos a look. Try to ignore the early stuff. It's kind of rough when we're still getting our feet. But yeah, like it would be great if you guys could come and check it out. And otherwise, I'm available Cold War host on Blue Sky, and I'm also my email at the Cold War channel at gmail.com.
Listeners, we're going to leave you there on the main episode. We're going to go talk about fun Soviet spy games and everything else in the extra bit. If you want access to that extra bit, untitled-history.com. Join up there and you get access to episodes without adverts. You get episodes to all my random posts about weird stuff I've found on YouTube, sometimes including David's content, to watch over the weekend. But also, you get access to the extra bit, and that's what we're going to go into now. And my final plea, as always, is remember, because we're a general history podcast, that means it's much harder for YouTube and Spotify to know how to recommend us to people. So we genuinely benefit more than even most channels do from you just tipping people off that we exist. If you've really enjoyed this episode, if you really enjoyed a previous episode, WhatsApp it to a friend, email it to a friend, write about it on Blue Sky and include a link and copy me and David in for this one. Get the word out that way, because word of mouth is absolutely critical to us expanding our reach and also getting us to know what kind of stuff you want on the podcast. It really helps with that. And drop a comment, leave a like. Tell us everything we've got wrong in this episode, or all the touch points that we didn't talk about. We mentioned various incidents of poking the bear. Pop in the comments and tell us what your favorite bear poking incident was in 1983. But on that note, we'll leave you. And extra listeners, hang around, join us over on Untitled-History.com, and we're going to carry on talking. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
And this stupid big giant red cup is great because it's this big giant red cup.
Yeah,
but
look.
I try not to drink from it on camera because.
So the nice thing about our format is because it's dual, it's guest and presenter, is actually when one of us drinks, and as long as the other one's talking, the other one gets pulled into being in full focus and the other one is not on camera.
Well, I wish I'd known that.
Yeah, I should have
but
mentioned that
anyways,
at the beginning.